it is incredible because we live in a time when the world is going through a churn of anti-racism protests. People are angry about colonialism. They're toppling statues of colonizers right here in San Francisco. They attacked Winston Churchill's statue. They toppled, Father Junipero Serra's, statue. So there's a lot of anger about colonialism and about liberating colonized people, about fighting racism and bigotry. And yet, the same media, the same intellectual and cultural world, which is professing to be fighting colonialism, has been incredibly silent and even complicit in the perpetuation of this phenomenon many of us are calling Hinduphobia. And I think we are at a very intense time, historically, politically, spiritually, for lack of a better word. So what I thought I would do today is try and address the question of Hinduphobia from a social scientific perspective, from the perspective of my subject, which is media studies. Three broad areas I'm going to talk about today. First, the term Hinduphobia itself and its career so far. Second, a brief history of the field of media studies. And third, the most important part, a media studies approach to Hinduphobia. So let's start with this term Hinduphobia. So what is Hinduphobia? Well, I guess a lot of us are using it, but then what it exactly is, different people may have different answers. Some people think it's not real. And even among the people who think it's real, and this is a key point I want us to think about, there are many people who don't like the name. There are people who say, yes, there is some kind of a strong anti-Hindu bias or prejudice in the world. It shows in our history. Our temples were destroyed. There's hate in so many religious ideologies. But then I don't know if Hinduphobia is the right word, because phobia implies fear, and people are not afraid of us, right? So that is one argument against the term. Another argument is it sounds like the term Islamophobia, and then people don't like that term. And then yet another argument that's made particularly by people who are somewhat right-leaning or right-wing identifying in India is, we don't believe in oppression Olympics, as they call it. So they think that it's somehow demeaning to talk about any kind of historic oppression. So we just believe in hard work. And I mean, I just threw in Ayn Rand as a little joke there, because I feel like sometimes people believe this right-wing ideology entirely. And frankly, in Indian civilization, in our philosophy, both these terms, right-wing, left-wing, don't really mean that much. So just making the distinction at the outset that I'm not a big fan of, the right-wing approach to all these issues. But anyway, so people have disagreements with the word. But broadly, we can start with a working understanding of its meaning. And that working understanding basically is that it's a term we use to name some kind of historically loaded hatred or prejudice or even violence against Hindus. Okay, so that the word is being used, it refers to something, I think, which is fairly real. Now, let's try and flesh this idea out a little more before we get into how we might look at it in the social sciences and in my field in particular. So one point I want to make right at the outset is that the term Hinduphobia doesn't have much or any legitimacy, frankly, in mainstream discourses. Okay, it has a fair amount of currency in everyday conversations, like forums like ours on the internet, in WhatsApp, in Twitter, Facebook, etc. But if you look at institutional discourses, so if you look at law, if you look at HR, human resources policies, if you look at the literature in various scientific journals, you will find that this term doesn't exist. People don't really believe it exists. And a very uncanny example, a reminder of this that came to me as I was typing up this presentation. So notice how the word Hinduphobia is automatically underscored in this computer program. You see the little dotted line there. Okay. Now, in the same sentence, you see Islamophobia, homophobia, all these words are not highlighted by the computer program. So whoever is designing software, all these computer platforms, they are also following these discourses, these rules that are being made in the social science disciplines of academia and are being fought for by various communities. So Islamophobia, whether you and I personally think it's real or not real, the world today thinks it's real and it's affecting you. Your computer will honor that term and won't underscore it saying there's no such word. Okay. And it's real in HR departments. It's real in so many ways. Hinduphobia, we have so many Indians working in software, but then that's who we are. We are mostly just workers. We don't have the kind of magical power and rulership that sometimes we think we have because we have a few Indian CEOs in Silicon Valley. We are completely unrepresented or even counter-represented. So just a small example I wanted to highlight. So that is the power of discourse. When a term is accepted in institutional discourses, it becomes real. The world has to follow it as if it's real. When a term is seen as illegitimate, we have to fight to make it real. That's where we are. So most institutions today might see, racism, casteism, all these things as very real. They don't see Hinduphobia as real, and they may even discredit. They may even say that Hindutva is like a right-wing conspiracy theory, and it's coming from people who hate minorities. They will completely deny any validity to the pain we face or the objective reasons we have for it. To give us a reality check, because frequently, I find on internet a lot of Hindus who are active on the internet will, say things like, "Oh yeah, the left liberals are getting scared. They're retreating because Hindus are getting more assertive, and we are fighting back and all these things," which sounds exciting. But I'm going to throw some cold water on it and give us some reality checks here, because if you look at it objectively, and here's a very simple way to look at it objectively, I just Googled each of these words, which are all used to describe forms of bias or oppression or violence, or systemic oppression, as it's often called in the social sciences today. And you can see that the term Hinduphobia really doesn't have as vast a presence in the public conversation today as some of these other terms. Right? You have terms like, transphobia, Islamophobia, sexism, racism, in the tens or even hundreds of millions of hits, because these are terms that a lot of people have put energy into circulating, and talking about. So we are, at a very, very, inconsequential phase of this term's usage. Now, if you look a little more closely at the institutional or discursive career of Hinduphobia, that is, if you look at how much bearing this term has in the scholarly literature, here too we find that the term Hinduphobia is appallingly low. Now, if you were to Google Hindutva or Hindu nationalism or Hindu extremism, I'm sure you would find thousands of results, because that's what scholars in my field are mostly working on. That's what they think is the important concern. Hinduphobia is largely deemed to be non-existent. And again, compare that. I mean, one argument is, oh yeah, well, we started talking about this only a few years ago because India was under Congress rule. It's only now in the last few years people are speaking up. If that argument really doesn't make that much sense, because if you look at a term like transphobia, it is so new, it's hardly 10 or 15 years old. And even Islamophobia, frankly, is very, very recent term. But they've all boomed in universities because there are professors teaching classes on it. There are conferences being held, so it's been validated very, very quickly and effectively. And of course, terms like anti-Semitism, sexism have an even longer career. But the important thing, again, is people have fought in so many ways for each of these terms to become treated as reality in the world. And we are, again, nowhere in the picture. So even if you look at these 100 or so, hits that come up when you Google the term Hinduphobia, um, you'll find there's very few publications actually in scholarly books or journals, and very few articles or books by credentialed scholars. Okay, at most we have a few publications by religion scholars, and that has its own peculiarities. But we don't really have people talking about Hinduphobia in, say, law or media studies or sociology or anthropology or criminology or management, all the different fields, because now every field in the world today studies and talks about sexism and racism. So that's how much of a reality it's considered. Hinduphobia, no field is really even talking about it yet. Okay. And one more thing to remember, even the few dozen results that come up, many of them are not even talking about the word Hinduphobia sympathetically. They just mention it to dismiss it. So, we are in a very, very weak situation as far as, our ability to self-represent our pain goes. Okay? So, what is it that I hope we will do, we'll accomplish with this talk and in the future? So, I've sort of laid it out, right now, because most of the time we hear the word, Hinduphobia, it's being circulated in certain sites, right? Social media, blogs, and sometimes some authors do a good job talking about it. Sometimes people just throw that word out there and hope it sticks, But anyway, it's not in any site which is consequential. Okay. So what do I mean by consequential sites, or I mean institutions, right? So where social science is produced, like university classes, conferences, books, etc. And then if you look at the attitude of the people using the term, and I know many of us are active on social media, there's a lot of enthusiastic voices there. People want to fight Hinduphobia on social media. Not all of us are in the social sciences. I recognize that, but I hope, by looking at this, we can figure out exactly where we are and what we can do better. Now, in social media, a lot of people who use the term Hinduphobia use it in a reactive way, almost in a consumerist way. So that word comes to you, you see that word, somebody else is using it, somebody you follow who's popular, is a social media star, there's using Hinduphobe, they're using quote unquote libtard or left liberal, what is the other one? Urban Naxal, whatever. So these are all, words that have been coined on social media, and people pick it up and just start throwing it here and there. Sometimes they have a minor effect. Most times, they don't go anywhere. But anyway, so that is the realm again of social media. But if you're in the social sciences, if you're trying to push an idea like racism or sexism or Hinduphobia there, you need to be productive about it, not reactive, and you need to locate it in existing research literature. You have to know the literature of a field and then say, hey, this is why I'm breaking from it, or this is how Hinduphobia needs to be added to it. Then in terms of the arguments, again, on social media, one of the things I find, people tend to focus too much on the intent. It's on individuals, like, oh, that person is urban Naxal, that person is a left liberal, so people are always trying to diagnose people's intention. So on social media, it's entertaining, but again, in reality, if you are trying to do this in the social sciences, you can't ever really talk about intent. You have to talk about the evidence that's appropriate to your field of study. So if you want to say there is Hinduphobia in history textbooks, you can't say, oh yeah, Congress government, was Congressy or something like that. In academia, you have to show the evidence, dig out all the textbooks, list everything, analyze it objectively. So that's how it works. And in terms of how even the causes of Hinduphobia is analyzed, and this is a key difference, in social media, people tend to focus mainly on, again, on groups, the political parties or certain religions, and there may be some truth to it, but unfortunately, this often makes it look like just a conspiracy theory. Now, if you were doing this in the social sciences, you would see Hindu phobia in relation to concepts of social political phenomena that others have already talked about, like imperialism, colonialism, racism, etc. So again, that is a key distinction. And finally, what are the differences in the outcomes? In social media, just given the nature of our addictions to phones and reacting immediately, our reactions tend to be ephemeral. We rarely have a lasting impact. And what we look for usually is like a gotcha reply, or as they say in America, or befitting reply, as we say in India. So, there's always this instant outburst bias. Whereas if you're doing it from a social science point of view, you want to look at long-term change, institutional change. These are the challenges, ahead, and what are some of the constraints we have today in terms of this idea of Hindu phobia not really going as far as it should have, considering that Hindus are a people of color, we're a formerly colonized people. All the liberals of the world should love us and say you guys are the heroes of the global resistance against colonialism, but instead they call us fascists. What has gone wrong with the liberals? So anyway, so there are two problems. One I'll call the academic Maya Sabha. Okay, that's the name of a chapter in my book Rearming Hinduism. And basically this refers to sort of the ideologies and paradigms in the social sciences, which have been really used to disenfranchise us, discredit us, whereas most other communities, Muslims, Arabs, people of color, blacks, women, Jews, everybody sort of stormed the social sciences and humanities since the 60s, and they've all got their own departments, they've got their own fields of study, they have their voice. Unfortunately, we don't really have that voice as Hindus or even as Indians, because the most we have now is this idea called South Asia, which I'll talk about a little later today as well. So the academic problem is one, but there's another problem which I frankly did not even realize a few years ago. When I wrote Rearming Hinduism, I was writing almost entirely from my experiences within the academy. I had very little direct experience with Hindu organizations or the many different people in the community, either independent or part of some political group, trying to do something. And so the last 3 or 4 years, I've come to the conclusion that a reality check is necessary, that while we have a lot of groups claiming to be Hindu advocacy groups, they've had almost no traction in terms of making a change in academia or in media or any institution that matters. And that is appalling because, any community which claims to have advocacy groups, which also claims that, the party they like is winning elections, there's an appalling reality that there's no change in the thinking in any mainstream institution, particularly in academia. So I want to talk a little bit about that as well, and just make the distinction that a lot of our energy has sort of been trapped into social media, where there's a lot of noise, and unfortunately a lot of narcissism there, and that's sort of where a lot of this so-called advocacy is sort of stuck in, because it has not paid attention to social science research. And that is something I must emphasize, because every community in America which has a voice today politically or culturally made use of social science research. Okay, so this was actually an article I saw a couple of days ago, which made me realize that this advocacy approach is really backfiring. I know it's a very strange headline, but it's by the journalist Chitra Subramanian, and she says there's no Hindu phobia. That's the argument. She's responding to Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard's statement a few months ago about the Hindu phobia she has faced. And that actually, when she said it, it really made a lot of people in America, people in the progressive, independent circles, realize that what many of the so-called progressives in America are phonies, that many of the so-called left liberals in America are actually right-wingers, by American terminology. They're intolerant, they're racist, they just hate Hindus. But anyway, so Tulsi Gabbard managed to bring that out. But this article is interesting because the author basically argues that there's no Hindu phobia, and Hindu phobia is just the product of a political lobby. Okay, and I realized this is actually, there is some truth to that part of her criticism, because uh, in the universities today, nobody is convinced that Hindu phobia is real, because they don't think of poor millions, hundreds and millions of poor, struggling Hindu farmers, Hindu villagers, Hindus from so-called, lower castes. They don't think of Hindu women facing, all sorts of problems from, grooming and assault. I mean, so many problems which we are aware of. The university is not aware of, because when they hear the word Hindu phobia, they think of a small group of very wealthy, successful Hindu immigrants going to Washington and saying, look, we are so rich, we are so good in studies, we win the spelling bees. Why are you not giving us good press? That's how it's coming across. And unfortunately, that is the argument that is being used to normalize Hindu phobia today, right? They say that Hindus are very rich, so why are you complaining? Racism is real because many blacks are poor. But Hindu phobia is not real because you Hindus in America are rich. So that is an argument that is backfiring. So just to give you an example, so I wanted to, again, look at some actual evidence over here. To ask the question, have advocacy groups in the US, because everybody's starting advocacy groups now, and I've just taken 3 as a random sample. And this seems to be the main approach in the Hindu community. Okay. Now, if you look at what they actually prioritize, if you look at their websites and accomplishments and things, you'll find that the concept of Hindu phobia, researching it in a professional manner, fighting it, activism against it, is virtually non-existent. Okay. What are their priorities? Here's one. This group has been there for almost 20 years. It's probably the most well-known one in the US. The Hindu Student Council, which is more oriented to students. So you can again see that word there, advocacy, empowerment. And if you look at their mission, it's about learning about Hindu heritage, their vision, development of an integrate personality, spiritual and cultural treasures. Another group which started earlier this year, again, you see youth, and there's interesting ideas and good intent. Obviously, I have no squabbles with that, but if you actually break it down and see what they're looking for, one goal seems to dominate, and that is this idea that they should be producing leaders of the community and something called the confident Hindu. Okay. So that is a very strange approach. I mean, where the whole priority is on personality development. Okay. So if that is a priority, they shouldn't be really calling themselves advocacy. Okay. It could be, this is also fine, but those are 2 different things. So what do these groups do? They're concerned about transmitting Hindu heritage to their children. They're concerned about, in effect, they function like socialization networks. Like we have Tamil Sangam, Telugu Association, Bengali Association. There's also like Hindu associations where people get together socially on weekends. We are immigrants in a different country. And a little bit of talk about, textbooks and politics and media, but hardly enough. And another problem also is this model minority approach. Okay, there's somehow a perception in the community here that because we are supposedly seen as a model minority, we don't do terrorism, we don't do riots, we just do good jobs. People are going to be nice to us, and people shouldn't say bad things about us in the media. Unfortunately, that is really, counterproductive, because this is, again, the very argument that's being used to say you can't complain about Hindu phobia because, Hindus are are successful, So, and a lot of Hindu children themselves, get angry with their parents and say, like, you're racist towards blacks. How can you uh, say all these things? So that's the generational issue is a much deeper one, but I'll just briefly mention it here. And of course, again, lack of scholarly tools and investment in research to really do something called advocacy the way other groups have done it. So this is a flow chart I wanted to mention. So if one really wants to see change, this is sort of how it has happened for various other groups and issues. So each of these terms, which today you see millions of hits on the internet, thousands of scholarly articles, millions of dollars invested in, promoting these ideas, they all start in universities. There's solid research done on them. And then they're also backed up by solid activism, whether it's civil rights in the 60s, the free speech movement in Berkeley, or more recently, even the BLM movement. I mean, whatever the politics and the violent fringes aside, all these ideas have become real. They have consequences. You could lose your job if you say something sexist or racist because African Americans, women, they've gone out on the street. And they've been doing it for 50 years. They've faced police dogs. They've faced police brutality to fight for their rights. And our community may not have to face that much violence, but it has to at least face the inconvenience of going out on the street. And we are not doing that over here. That is how they've changed things. So if we want to really bring about a change, what we need is not just Twitter talk that, a party we liked won the election, or left liberals are getting scared, and all these palliative measures which don't mean anything. We need to make anti-Hindu phobia a force. And for that, we need activism, we need protests, we need people on the street ready to show up outside, Netflix or Disney or NDTV or whoever. I mean, don't be violent, don't break the law if you don't want to. But in a free country, we have the right to stare a hateful person in the eye and say, look, what you're doing is wrong. I mean, even Gandhi today, who a lot of Hindus are upset with, he had the courage to starve himself and put his body on the line. And we have internet anti-Gandhis, today boasting about how, their Hindus are becoming confident. No, So we need research, we need activism. Okay. So I wanted to give one example of what professional advocacy, high end, really looks like. This is a movie that has just come out on Netflix. It's called The Social Dilemma. It's a documentary about the big IT companies, Google and Facebook, and many concerns about that. So the people who made this movie have this outfit now called Center for Humane Technology. And like anything with the word humane, I'm a little suspicious, like humane slaughter or humane, beef or whatever they call it. I mean, at one level, I think this is the Silicon Valley giants sort of trying to cover their tracks and offer some measure of accountability and say, look, we hear your concerns about privacy, etc. But what is interesting, and the reason I showed this, is the amount of attention the site pays to research in psychology and sociology and politics. Okay, so they have a list of different kinds of harm that is being done by social media addiction, by Google, by Facebook, etc. Right, and for each of these categories, like impact on attention, look at that. They cite a peer-reviewed journal source. So this is advocacy. This is real stuff, because they're connecting academia into people's lives, and they have the money. They'll send people to schools, educate school children, and so there's an enormous amount of investment that different groups go into getting their message out, and we haven't done that for anti-Hindu phobia till now. Academic work on Hindu phobia so far. So I wanted to give you a quick example of the little work, the few results we find. Digital Hinduism has a wonderful chapter on Hindu phobia and right-wing Christian websites by Sachi Edwards. And then this book below, Ethics, Ethnocentrism, is has been published just this month. I have a chapter in there on how to study Hinduphobia in media, and that is basically what my talk today is sort of based on as well. So these two books are an example of the word Hinduphobia showing up in scholarly literature, but then again, here you can see these scholars are arguing that it's not real. Okay, so this is the dominant paradigm. So let's get quickly into this definition of Hinduphobia as well, and then I'll go on to the media part. I'm sure you're looking for examples. So this is one scholarly source which defines Hinduphobia by Professor Jeffrey Long. As you can probably sense, has taken a very, very shy approach to defining this concept. It's kind of like sometimes Hinduphobia is real, sometimes it's in the eye of the beholder. It's very controversial. And he gets into this, again, this advocacy Maya Sabha trap, right? So he kind of says the term was coined and popularized by, advocacy groups and non-academic writers and so on. At least, writers who are not from the academy. Now, popularized would be a fair description, but he actually says coined. And now, this is one of the reasons why the word Hinduphobia has been discredited and attacked so viciously in academia the last 10 years, because even scholars like Long sort of say that this has been, an advocacy group came up with it. Now, the reality actually is that the term Hinduphobia was not coined in the 1990s by any advocacy group or Hindu community leader. This term has been in use since 1883. By the way, I want to draw your attention to this beautiful image. Look at the Om resisting, fighting back. That is Hindu human rights. They're a very, very, fierce and honest and smart anti-Hinduphobia group based in London. So a scholar named Sarah Gates, who's doing a PhD in cultural studies, did the research and found out that the term Hinduphobia has been in use for, 1, 2, 3 centuries now. And it's just that we somehow never paid attention to it. And of course, she has a nice working definition. It's a modern term for an ancient practice. Now, here's a key point I just want to mention. Why is this finding important? This is not to deny credit to anyone who has popularized the term, but the biggest argument that the academic establishment has been making against this term is that Hinduphobia is an invention of the BJP and other political groups, right? And when you look at this fact, you can see that this word, was in use before there was a BJP or even before there was RSS for that matter. So, people were talking about it in the context of actual anti-Hindu hatred in colonial times. 1883, an English newspaper. 1914, an American student newspaper. Somebody's talking about, the anti-Hindu, anti-immigrant, rhetoric at that time in America, which would later culminate in this horrible book called Mother India in the 1920s by Kathleen Mayo, which basically was a eugenics, racist, religious supremacist argument, and which actually led to an immigration ban. From the 1920s till 1965, Indians could not immigrate there. Indians and most other people of color. So anyway, so we are now in a time when a lot of these arguments are being made again. Now, here's the best part of this article. Sarah found that even a great person like Sardar Patel used the term Hinduphobia in a speech about Churchill in 1948. Okay, so this term has a very long and rich history. We just have to, stop shying away from using it. And not handicap ourselves with, advocacy Maya Sabha. So the Hindu Human Rights Group has a great definition, covers so many angles. This is the power of street activists. They cover the micro and macro picture in this talk, which is, media studies definition of Hinduphobia, right? Because media studies obviously has a lot of research on sexism in the media, racism in the media, Islamophobia in the media. How do we do this very valid and important work in my field? So media can be confronted with the evidence, and media professionals will start to change, at some level at least, because many idealistic people do go into journalism and arts as well, and it's sad that most of them fail to get a connection with the Hindu community or the Hindu cause, and then they end up going over to the other side, which is way cooler. Anyway, so these are some of the literatures like on colonialism, on racism, and all of which, sort of are pertinent here. What does a media studies perspective look like? So I want to talk broadly about this field, the origin of this field. So showing you two memorable movie posters. The field began around the 1920s. And of course, that's Charlie Chaplin, Modern Times. And this other picture is sort of the future of technology, virtual reality, gaming, exploitation, all these issues. So the earliest research on media began in the 1920s. And the context of that, again, is captured so nicely in this Modern Times poster. You see this, helpless, but, good-spirited human being standing there, and he's dwarfed by these giant impersonal machines and those chimneys spewing smoke. And that was society. In the 1920s, people were frightened about this new way of life that had quickly taken over the West, the Industrial Revolution, the destruction of traditional, village life, the horrible slaughter of World War I, exploitation of labor in the factories. So many issues were going on. And Charlie Chaplin made a beautiful movie about it in Modern Times as well. If you look more specifically at where this concern about media studies has come from, first, the 1920s is also the time that the social sciences sort of came into academia, right? The sciences and technology, engineering were booming. Social science was an attempt to sort of replicate the methods of science, objective study and measurement in the study of human behavior. So fields like psychology and sociology began to proliferate. There are obviously limits to how much you can try to do something called social science or human sciences. Sometimes social sciences were useful. They helped shape, housing policies, health policies, but then they were also very, very racist. People gathered, all kinds of spurious data to argue about, racial inferiority and keep out immigrant groups, those kind of things. The big phenomena which concerned scholars was this term called mass society. Again, just think of that Charlie Chaplin picture. So world is changing, and then the human being is isolated, exploited, and there's all these new technologies of communication coming in, like cinema and radio and novels, and what is going on, what's it doing to people? So that was sort of the concern. And specifically, the single biggest driver of media research and even media technologies, frankly, was the US military. After the end of World War I, the military was convinced that propaganda was a very powerful instrument, that communication was a powerful tool. So they began to support research on how communication could be used for propaganda and counter-propaganda. And I use the term military-industrial communications complex because that is a reality in America that many scholars talk about. This is, of course, the famous Uncle Sam Wants You recruitment poster. So starting in the 20s, you see this huge investment in using communication to basically fulfill America's war economy needs, and everything else is secondary to that. But on the good side, scholars emerge. They start doing research on a lot of interesting issues. This is a famous study I thought I should mention. It's called The Invasion from Mars. 1939, the movie director Orson Welles did a radio play, War of the Worlds, and thousands of people panicked. They ran away from their homes because they thought that there really was an invasion from Mars. So the scholar Harry Cantrell did a study to try and determine what variables were at play. Why did some people panic, others didn't? So just an example of the kind of research people were doing. But by the 1930s, the field sort of began to grow in two different directions, both of which used good social science tools. One was a critical tradition, which is research for its own sake, just trying to understand why communication, how and why communication influences people. The other is called administrative research, which is doing media research for business. Like George Gallup is the most famous person, like the Gallup opinion poll. So I want to just make this distinction because many people think media studies means helping the media make more Bollywood movies or make more money through IPL or whatever. That is one part of it. But my own field is more in this tradition. We're concerned with media as a more in a more civic manner, in a commercial manner. So Harold Laswell coined this sort of formula. I wanted to mention this because, in a sense, we'll come back to it with the study of Hindu phobia. Who says what in which channel to whom with what effect? And this is important because this sort of maps out all the different kinds of media research that are possible, right? Like, who owns the media? What are the rules of media ownership? Content analysis. If you study the media content objectively, what do you find? Technology issues, audience research, who is watching, how do they interpret media? So he sort of, gave a shape to the whole field. And then 60s, 50s and 60s, this approach sort of peaked and a new approach began in the 70s. And this is where my talk gets a little colorful. So this new approach that started in England in the 70s called critical cultural studies focused on two issues which no one really had talked about before. One was meaning, right? How do media messages actually become meaningful to audiences? And second, power, the question of power. Not just one-to-one influencing people or manipulating people, but historical power, which groups of people control society, issues like that. So one example of semiotic analysis, I love this ad. It was in many magazines in India also in the 1990s. It's an ad for Smirnoff vodka. But what is interesting is the imagery here. So I use this example, to teach my students how to do semiotic analysis. So I thought I'll do a quick run through of this. So semiotics operates on this idea that everything is a sign, everything has meaning, and every sign can be broken down into two parts, a signifier and signified, right? And the signifier is the physical part of a sign, and the signified is the meanings we give to it, okay? So I'm sort of rushing through this in a simple manner. And a very key idea here is that semiotics says the relationship between the signifier and signified is an arbitrary one, okay? So there's no real logical reason why a cat should be called a cat and not a dog. It's just convention. So now I'm discovering there's actually strong arguments against that in Indian philosophy, like Ram Swaroop's work, I think is monumental and everyone needs to read that. But going with this framework for now, the idea that many meanings are based on codes which are arbitrary or a matter of convention, we can now apply it to this ad, okay? So when I show my students this ad and say, come up with a slogan for it, inevitably, and this has been happening for 25 years, they come up with one word, and that word is cool. So drink Smirnoff, be cool. That is sort of the message of the ad they see. Then we break it down into signifiers and signified. What are the signifiers, the physical parts? Okay, you have the layout, the color, the pictures, the text, these objects here, these heads, the blue sky, and then you have this particular head seen through the bottle, which has the bandana, glasses, earphones. And then we say, look, think about it. We get the meaning in a flash, but when you analyze it, you realize it's actually this particular arrangement of objects, these signifiers, which invoked the signified called cool, coolness. And how did we know that? Somebody who doesn't know sunglasses are cool might look at it and say, oh no, this poor guy is sick or he's blind. Who knows? It's a different reading. It's possible. But we know that because we have the cultural competence to decode it in a certain way. And then we ask the question, where do these cultural competencies come from? They come from certain ideologies, certain worldviews. In this case, it's the worldview of tourism, the worldview of consumerism. And where did that come from ultimately? It came from the 500 years of European colonialism. Because when you think about it, this object actually was not meant for us to look in a magazine through a Smirnoff bottle and think cool, right? It was meant because the people who made it had different meanings for it. Maybe they were gods, maybe they were heroes, whatever else it was. But that story has vanished. Okay, and this is a case of the Easter Island. It's the case of the Egypt, temples and pyramids. The case of ancient Greece. Uh, those stories are gone. Those worldviews are gone. So what has been naturalized now is this new hegemonic condition of global modernity, of empire. So this kind of analysis, I'm giving you one quick example here. When you look at this image, this is the cover of Time magazine from 1947, supposed to be about India's partition. So you can see what has happened here. This is supposed to be goddess Kali. And you see this utter desecration, and appropriation and blame, right? It's saying Hindus and Muslims are killing each other. But obviously, it's not a fair assessment when only one religion is being symbolized as the cause of violence here. That's one. But if you look at it from the semiotic point of view, you can see there's an indigenous view, the meanings or signifieds we bring to our symbols, and there's a colonial view. And what is happening in this image is a colonial view has been naturalized. So the more people do this, the more people take images out of context and naturalize new ways of looking at it, those end up becoming tropes. Those end up becoming even common sense. And those of us who still say, no, this is our goddess, we can be creative, but we must also be respectful. People will say, oh no, you fundamentalist. So see how the power game turned against us. So this causes epistemic violence. Epistemic means how we know things, causes material violence. Okay. So some recent examples of this, you might have seen this. Kamala Harris's niece tweeted this image of her aunt in the shape of goddess Durga. Then this coronavirus doctor tribute going on. And this is actually a very subtle thing, because most people might say, oh, this is nice, we must honor our doctors. But when you look at it in the broader history of iconoclasm, why is the goddess actually surrendering her authority, right? I mean, she could be blessing the doctor. That would be wonderful. And, or a patient can even honor the doctor as the goddess Durga. That's also wonderful. But this gesture rankles me. I find that, very, very deliberate and offensive. And then this one, you might remember last year, that horrible incident when a pregnant elephant was killed in Kerala. And this cartoon circulates saying Ganeshji is refusing, puja. So implication is Hindus are hypocrites. They'll do puja to elephant and give a bomb. And that crime was not committed by Hindus. So, you can see this example again, how, science, so many science proliferating, transforming how we look at the world. Let me quickly go back to where the field of media studies has gone. So using the semiotic perspective, a lot of audience research took place, like racism in the media, Cosby Show. In the 90s, I wrote my first book, Becoming a Global Audience. This was about MTV in India, again, using the similar perspective. Of course, those days I was still not really aware that there was a problem called Hinduphobia, and I'll get to that in a minute. So I want to just talk about where the field of media studies is today and why it resists Hinduphobia or accepting this concept. Now, cultural studies always believed that research should be about helping the world. It should be about politics, social change, all these things. And it saw race, class, and gender as the main concepts, main axes along which oppression and injustice was occurring in the world, and wanted to fight that. And then it sort of grew and went in all directions. And the problem now today is that on the one hand, it has helped a lot of communities find a voice. But the problem also is that it has, virtually replaced the idea of truth with the primacy of identity. And that has led to all kinds of problems, which you might call, the left, far left issues and so on. But having said that, here is specifically one point where there's an absurd dilemma which confronts Hindus, or the study of Hinduphobia. Cultural studies believes that representation is the key issue in media studies. Okay, so a lot of concepts like Orientalism, Islamophobia have become, normal concepts. People study these. You know, these are very, very famous books in the field. So a Muslim or an Arab or a Chinese or Korean or Japanese American can look at the media and say, look, that is yellow peril, that is anti-Asian racism, and it's accepted. But when Hindus do that, it's not accepted at all, because many of the studies of Hinduism or Hindus in general today in the field of media studies are like this. They don't talk about Hindu phobia or Hindu misrepresentation. They talk about Hindutva or Hindu nationalism. They talk about Hinduism basically as a danger to minorities and things like that. So each of these books is very important to understanding how this field, which was supposed to be about, race, class, and gender, actually turned against people who are racial and class and gender minorities. Another example of the dominant view of this article claiming that Amar Chitrakada has no diversity and causes intolerance. So this is a problem in the field. Now, having said that, media studies does talk about representation for people from India, but it does so only under this label called South Asia. So famous documentary on the Simpsons cartoon, it says, the problem with Apu, and it says, there's racism against South Asians in America. But then they never talk about the fact that a part of that racism is also specifically Hinduphobic. So this is the situation, Hindus are basically not permitted. By permitted, I mean by academic literature, academic consensus today, to just say that something is false about Hindus or is, racist against Hindus. No. And the reason for that is this whole strange, Hindu means Hindu nationalist, means white nationalist, etc. This whole bizarre thing. My view is that this dichotomy is false. This idea that the same human being cannot be okay if he says he's South Asian and not be an oppressor if he says he's Hindu. That's a false dichotomy. And that regardless of whether one believes in that Hinduphobia is real or not, you can study Hindu representation objectively. You can study so many parts of the media world to just try and understand how this idea of Hinduism is being constructed over there. And the biggest reason I think why this problem exists is, race, class, gender is accepted as fact today in social sciences. Sexuality also. Race, class, gender, sexuality are supposed to be like the real important concepts by which we understand society. They have really sidestepped the question of religion. Okay, and religion is very important, particularly if you want to understand the global impact of colonialism. If we want to understand that, we have to understand where the ideologies of colonialism and conquest came from. Why did Christopher Columbus come and slaughter the indigenous people of the Americas, or Pizarro in South America, or Vasco da Gama in India, or the Portuguese Inquisition, or the British, or the Mughals? All of this was driven by intolerant religious ideology, and that is something the social sciences really, if they want to remain, or if they want to regain some credibility, they have to start opening up. And there are scholars pushing for it. There are Native American scholars. There's a small handful of Hindu scholars who are doing it, and we'll do our best. Okay, so the last part, a media studies view of Hinduphobia. I'm presenting, just a few ideas now from this chapter of mine, which has just been published. So this sort of engages with the literature and media studies, what I've done to kind of make the argument that, this singular obsession with this idea of Hindu nationalism while denying Hinduphobia is wrong. that media scholars need to actually objectively count and study Hindu representation. So this is a chapter, and um, so this is sort of the core of this chapter, because in this chapter I proposed a research design for one kind of media research called a content analysis, because most other communities have done that for their representations. And I identify different levels at which we can analyze media content. So, newspapers, movies, magazines, social media feeds, whatever else it is, uh, to try and objectively understand Hindu representation. First level is very objective, it's quantitative. Okay. So, there are some accepted tools for studying bias, media bias. We can use those. The second level is colonial tropes. So India was a colonized country, so we have the right, moral and historical right to say that we are affected by colonial tropes. And other scholars, from Africa, Latin America, have talked about these stereotypes or tropes, which Europeans invented, to justify their conquest of the, people of Asia, Africa. Then there are more specific tropes about Hinduism, which can also be talked about. And these tropes are interesting because sometimes the tropes can be based on some partial truth or an exaggeration of some reality in a very, very skewed manner. Sometimes the tropes could be completely misleading, like sati. People just say sati for, if somebody says, yeah, media should be more honest about Hindus, and they'll say, oh, do you want to bring back sati? That's insanity. So that's an example of just a weaponized trope. It has no connection. Then finally, dehumanization tactics, and this is something I'd like everyone to pay close attention to, because what I'm finding is in the last 2-3 years, especially when I write that column in Medium and so on, what you're seeing is not just ordinary misrepresentation or laziness or paid media stuff. What we are seeing is weapons grade dehumanization propaganda techniques being deployed against Hindus, and it is very scary. So let me share this in some detail with some examples. So this is from my chapter. I identified different things that you can look at over here. So this is one example. So for example, item 2 is the labeling of aggressors and victims in a selective manner. Okay, so you might have seen examples like this, right, where the identity of somebody who does a crime is actually, either is concealed, or in this case, it is outright factually misrepresented. So this was a case where, it wasn't a tantric who did this crime. I think it was it was a person of another religion, but then they used the word tantric. And here, look at this picture. It says fake priests and their trials of abuse. And when you click on that story, actually, it's a story about abuse in the church, right? But they haven't shown a Christian priest; they show a Hindu priest. So there's a lot of this going on, and I know people notice this on Twitter and they share it. But what social scientists have to do is, start bringing it together, start collating the data, so it's all there in one place. So these are just more ideas for coding. Then from 7 onwards, we get into colonial tropes, which is themes that have been identified by other scholars as images that were used by the colonial powers to devalue the colonial natives. So one example is this one, treating Hindu deaths as unimportant. So the number here sort of refers to my coding table, okay? So this is a very famous example. This is the comedian Trevor Noah. This was just after the Pulwama terror attack when 40 people died and there was, a lot of tension about war. This guy makes a joke and he sings a song in Bhangra style saying, "Time for you to die." He would not do that. I mean, if 40 Israelis were killed or 40, Palestinians were killed, 40 people of any religion or nationality were killed, no entertainer in America would laugh and sing a song. But they do it because that dehumanization is now so widespread, So another trope is blaming the victim, where, Hindus are now depicted as oppressors. So I wanted to share this picture. This is from the anti-CAA protests last year. Um, so here's a Muslim lady saying Hindu India is Nazi Germany. And this is outright. I mean, when I show this to my students, people, they get it immediately. Like, it's like if you look at the world in terms of identity and privilege, you somebody a white guy doesn't go to India and then lecture them, and doesn't get to call people of color Nazis, which is what he's doing over here. So again, this is what is going on. Then there are tropes which are very specific to depictions of Hindus right from the time of colonial missionary literature. For example, this hatred towards idols, or specifically our gods. Why even use the word idols? For them, it's idol hate. For us, it's attack on our gods. So movies like PK, Slumdog Millionaire, where gods are associated with violence or with toilets in this case, this is sheer classic colonial religious hatred. Another common theme is this idea that a religion is stagnant and somehow needs to be reformed. So this is a progressive magazine, and these guys are just openly saying it, like just convert. This is probably the most widespread trope, and that is, this kind of hatred towards priests, sadhus, Brahmins, religious people. I showed this example in my class, the saffron terrorism. And I asked my students, and the media students are very savvy at analyzing these things. So I said, what exactly is the terror part of it? And they said, there's nothing. They said, are these Buddhist monks who are meditating? That's what my students kind of saw this as. Because, to an average person, this image is very peaceful, right? It's just a bunch of, spiritual people who are sitting and meditating. But look at this phrase, saffron terrorism. That's how they're normalizing, this is propaganda. And this fat, priest over here is from a Telugu movie on Adi Shankara. It was completely unnecessary, but this has just become like a movie industry masala item now. Important work, Vishwa Adluri's book, The Nay Science, where he sort of shows where this priest hatred or Brahmin hatred or sadhu hatred, all of these came from to India. It was the German missionaries who projecting their anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism, onto Hindus, 2-3 centuries ago. So this is a very common trope as well. So yeah, many more tropes I've identified. I'll put my chapter up on academia in a few days. There's a lot of these not just anti-Hindu themes, but propaganda techniques that are also at play. So one of these is number 24, scaring people about everyday Hindu symbols. The New York Times had an article about how the sari had become a symbol of Hindu nationalism. Scroll had an article about how Rasam was Brahmanism, So they're doing a lot of this kind of stuff as well, and this is, demonization, nothing less. So here's an article about Steve Bannon, former Trump ally, and they pick a picture of him with a tilak on his face, So all the time trying to hit this idea that, white supremacy is Hinduism and, just cheap stuff. And this is very disturbing. Classic dehumanization technique, which was done by Hitler's Nazis. It was the Americans did it to the Japanese in World War II. It is the use of, using images of dirt and filth to smear somebody they don't like. So this is from Slumdog Millionaire. It's a horrible scene in the movie. I'll move away from it. It's quite yucky. Now they're doing this on purpose, right? They want to associate India with sewage. And this is another classic propaganda technique, depicting people of a minority group, racial or religious minorities, as animals. And this is The Guardian, which is supposed to be a progressive, anti-racist newspaper. And they showed Preeti Patel, who's a Hindu minister in England, in like this monster. And they get away with it because somehow these are, white so-called liberals in London depicting a Hindu woman of color like this. And they get away with it because they're so sure that, they are liberals and anti-racist, and Preeti is in the Conservative Party, so it's okay. So anyway, so this is a level of madness that's going on. And some of you might remember this. This was a correspondent for, or a reporter for NPR, the National Public Radio, who tweeted this, and there was a huge storm about it. She resigned, but NPR never even took down her articles or put a note saying that her objectivity might have been compromised. So, but this cow piss trope is again a classic dehumanization technique. So I sort of offer a definition of Hinduphobia for media researchers. Basically, from everything I'm looking at, I'm seeing it not just as stereotyping, but as a form of propaganda. And I'll just move on quickly so I can wrap up in the next 3 or 4 minutes. Then we can take some questions. So broadly, since I promised to lay out some ideas for a media studies view of Hinduphobia, I'm going back to that Lasswell's model, which is sort of the template for my field. So who says what, to whom, with what effect? Really, there's so many research topics that could be explored by scholars. Like institutions, who owns mass media? Who's got money in, Huffington Post? Is it Omidyar Group? What about Al Jazeera? What about The Economist? Where did their wealth come from? What are their business interests in India? What are their interests in, say, defanging the cow protection movement? Who are their advertisers? Is McDonald's advertising for them? Is that why they want to demonize Gorakshaks? Who knows? There's so many questions you can explore at the institutional level. Then at the level of text, you can do the kind of coding content analysis I just showed, looking at data objectively. And then this is challenging, but it's great fun. Doing audience research, actually interviewing people, doing surveys, doing ethnographies of violence. When riots take place in Bengal or in Kashmir or Bangladesh or Pakistan, I wish we had trained researchers who had the grants to go and actually find out the role of media in whipping up hate. I know Swati Goel Sharma does a great job. Some of her articles are just fantastic. But apart from her, I don't really know anyone else, collating this kind of research and work. So a lot of work that needs to be done. So just by way of conclusion, why we must act, what we can do. The important thing I would like us to remember, media are powerful. Most of us view media only as consumers. So we tend to think that it's just there to entertain us, and sometimes we may get annoyed with it. And looking forward to your questions. I'll just wrap up in 2 more minutes. Thank you. So remember that most researchers of media do believe that media is powerful, and media are concerned about this US military industrial communications complex, because the media is not just about business, it's about actually spreading the American empire now. It's really out of control. They're actually manufacturing excuses to go to war, the way they did with Iraq 20 years ago. And then research has found that long-term media does have effect on perceptions. It's called cultivation research. And then there's a lot of scholarship on representation, dehumanization, genocide, all these things. So I thought I'll leave us with these examples. Representations are important. Somebody who's beaten up for wearing a thread in Tamil Nadu, the sadhus who were murdered in Palghar while the police just, let it happen. That's in our time, but if you look at it historically, 1971 Bangladesh, till a couple of years ago, I never knew that the Bangladesh massacres that the victims were largely Hindu. That's how much it's been covered up. And the US government, Nixon, allowed it to happen. He hated, Hindus like Churchill and many others. British colonialism, partition, Hampi, Ayodhya, Kashi. The list goes on. And at the core of it always is a cultural idea, is a representation idea, communication idea, right? This word kafir or heathen, thousands of years of war and conquest. And of course, resistance from us too. Let's not forget that. So resistance continued. That was a perfect transition. My last few points. 1, please consider supporting research. If you have institutional support, try and see how, proper research centers can be set up for anti-Hindu phobia work, not just, studying Sanskrit and Vedas. And that is important too, but that's beautiful. We all need that. but that won't solve the problem of fighting Hindu phobia. Learning Vedas and doing Vedic scholarship will help, put off some of the Doniger Pollock effect, and that is important. But we also need active social science work and activism. Second, social media. I know many of you are active on social media. Remember, social media is not a revolutionary tool. It's a tool that these big corporations like Apple, Google, Facebook are using to try and control our energy, narrow our imagination. Look at how easily they block or just take away accounts like True Indology, for example. I mean, there's so much scholarship there, and they just do that with impunity. So remember that we have to get off social media. Social media leads to revolutions only if people actually gather in Tahrir Square or Rajpath or outside the Netflix office or wherever else it is. There has to be real life action. And one of the only thing I've written in caps lock here, and this really concerns me, I see a lot of Hindus boasting on social media that we are Hindus, we don't do protests. My God, that is sheer cowardice. No one admires you for that. Please don't fall for that. And also help the few researchers who are doing this work. Keep our work separate from the ideologues and IT cells and the noisemakers. Let them do their thing. Let us do our thing. One more thing, please set a good example to your children, those of your parents. Don't indulge in movies which are desecrating or insulting Hinduism. Talk about it, but in a civil manner, right? If you get into rants about religions, most children today won't like it. So learn to talk about it professionally as not so much as a left versus right or Hindu-Muslim issue, but just as a racism versus fair representation issue. So train your children to fight propaganda. These are just some issues for media scholars. Ultimately, the good thing about Hindu philosophy, Hindu thought, as I'm discovering, is, we don't just have to get into media studies to fit into their categories. Ultimately, getting recognition of the Hindu phobia idea, fighting Hindu phobia is step one. Step two is epistemic decolonization, ultimately revolutionizing the theory of communication. I mean, the more I learn about the philosophy of Sanskrit and Shabda and, ideas like Rasa and Bhava, I mean, it's mind-blowing. I mean, media studies will never be the same again if these ideas really, took root in our hearts and lives. So finally, just some resources, further reading. There's a great movie on propaganda. It's on Amazon. So all of these links, I'll request Sangam Talks to share. So that's my talk. Looking forward to a few questions. Thank you for listening.
I'm very thankful for attending this, especially as a journalism student. I see quite a lot of soft Hindu phobia even in my own college and all. So first thing I want to say is one thing, sir, I would like to highlight is this depiction of Hindu women in media, sir, especially Hindu phobic media. And especially Netflix platforms and all, they depict Hindu women as like against the culture itself, and who are very much deprived of love, and who are against Hindu men and all, and who are attention starved, and who seek it from other men from other religions. That is, I feel that that's also very demeaning. Like recently there was a huge controversy when one woman who made a post for smashing the stereotypes and patriarchy on Women's Day, she cut off her sari, but on another day she wore the nun's dress with pride without cutting it off. That is also there. And then there's this recent cartoon of a Muslim kid who beat a sadhu in yoga with the help of a genie and all. And then there's also another thing I've noticed is that some Kashmiri Pandits on social media who talk about their sufferings, they are labeled as, oh, you're playing your victim card, go away, ha ha ha, and all that. So, and another thing which I have personally faced is when I posted on Instagram against Saif Ali Khan's statement on Ravana just Ravana's role justifying Sita, my own classmates and friends were like, "Oh, you need to broaden your perspective. There's another side to it. You do realize that Ramayana is just ancient propaganda tool for justifying Hinduism, right? Ravana is also really amazing." Like, I try to answer them as best as I can, but sir, what is your state on that?
First of all, thank you for speaking and for sharing that you're a journalism student. I'm so glad that, in spite of this very hostile worldview, and one of the reasons I said things are not getting better is because media studies was not as viciously and extremely anti-Hindu 20 years ago. I think it was still a little more accommodating to other views. And today, from everything I've seen, from the few talks I've given in mass comm schools in India, and from what I see, you are definitely facing a tremendous challenge intellectually. Uh, I think the important thing is, trying to approach it from the point of view of um, your profession, right? As a journalist, as somebody who believes the media can be a force for good, who believes in truthful representation. Almost everything that is going on is absolutely toxic and hostile. You know that, but pace yourself out is what I can say, because particularly, when people are not willing to listen, it can be very, very draining. So, be good spirited. Don't fall into the trap of making it a political defense, because that becomes very easy for people to discredit, because then you're carrying a lot of baggage, and I would write about RSS or BJP to the extent, and I did the first 2 3 years, 2014 15, to the extent that I felt the record had to be corrected. But after that, I'm not in this to be co-opted by any political party, or become their cheerleader, because that's the nature of the political machine. That's what they want. So I think it's, as long as you're clear in your mind that your duties as a journalist, as a citizen, as a human being, as a person who respects the idea of dharma, all these things. And I think your words and your career can be very powerful, because just looking at all the examples you've given me, you're observing all the right things. And please do connect with me on Instagram or Twitter, and I'll follow you back. And I'd love to stay in touch, because you're a journalism student.
Again, being in the US, I have seen a huge shift in terms of the perception of what Hinduism is. And I think Hindu-phobia has gained, I think, a little more traction in the recent past. And I view it as an organized onslaught by mainly left-leaning and unfortunately Indian origin academics in some Ivy League institutions. To the extent that you have even seen fake news being propagated by New York Times, etc., especially about the Delhi riots. And not only that, it's being lapped up by the Hindu, I would say, population within the US, if not the West. For example, there was a students' union or a Hindu students' union condemning Holi, based on a fake news narrative by some of these left-leaning publications. So we have already seen a pattern of Western-induced self-loathing in Hindus at epidemic proportions in India and within expatriate communities. But what I, as an individual living overseas of Indian origin, what I see is that there's a lack of a concerted counter narrative, right, to hold these people accountable. For example, if a publication is making fake news that's Hindu-phobic, can they be even sued about it? Because there's no basis in truth about what they're doing. But I just feel that, there has to be a concerted counter narrative. And you can find very few people involved in that purpose. I mean, Rajiv Malhotra is doing some of the work, and there are, just a handful of other people. So I just wanted to know your thoughts about this and how best to tackle this on a, I would say, community scale.
So, yeah, I don't know if you were here for the first part of the talk when I talked about what I call the advocacy Mahasabha. When the recording is up, I would urge you to, pay close attention to that, and also to my ebook, Writing Across a Cracked World. Particularly if you're active on social media, that may be useful for you. See, I think the problem is, this advocacy, or, the community concerns. First of all, it's very small, very limited resources. That's a reality. But then after 20-30 years of people getting upset about it and nothing changing, One, of course, yeah, people are very deeply entrenched on the other side. Post 2014, it was, I think 2014 to 15, there was a window of opportunity to make the democracy dividend work. But then, for whatever reason, either inaction, ineptitude, or political calculation, the new government in India really did not get into the game. And I saw that whole thing slipping away very close. So what has happened is, whatever, it's like, let's say Hindu phobia was at, 8 out of 10 scale of absurdity till 2014. I mean, till 2014, one subtle difference you'll notice is they were largely demonizing, Modi ji and, BJP and Hindu nationalism. Post 2015, all bets are off, It's like anything Hindu, the sari, rasam, bindi, just go after anything. And it's working. And there are customers for it. As you said, a lot of students in American campuses stand up. So in terms of what can be done, why aren't people suing? Why aren't people doing anything? Again, like I said, it'll start happening only if we, get off social media and get into the real world. And also, if you want to actually, if somebody wants to put the money and, sue somebody, where is the data, right? I mean, who are the academics who are going to come and speak up? There's just very, very few of us. If we had the resources and support, we could be doing a lot more work. But ultimately, there has to be that academic activist, trust to the community. And most of what is passing for advocacy is just eyewash today. I think that's the harsh truth.
You were talking about the little model. You had a little model up about academic research being followed by activism. Today, we see a lot of activism. Personally, I'm a student at the University of Toronto, and I try to just inform my friends, my classmates, just about issues that Hindu issues. But the question that I usually get is where's the proof? Where is do you have any articles to point to? Do you have any sort like reputed sources to point to? And that's when I have nothing. Because most of the information we get is from through family members, through friends, or people who are actually experiencing it in real life. So how do we go about building this this academic research? Because activism just as we're doing it now, it's not good enough, because you'll always be seen just as a nationalist or something, because that's how we get labeled as. So how would you say we should go about creating that academic research? Because we don't have a voice in academia, as you said. I personally have had to deal with professors who are like openly Hindu phobic.
What is your major, if I may ask?
My major is political science and religion.
Oh, wow. Okay, there you have it. Well, I'd love to connect with you because, well, first of all, thank you and for braving it and coming it into this field and not going into STEM. We've lost too many people to STEM who are not in a position to fight the good fight. So, but being in the social sciences right now is very, very challenging. But I'm sure, you with single-minded devotion to truth, and I mean, we are lucky we have so many gods and goddesses for learning to help us. In the long haul, it will work out, in the sense you will be able to speak the truth, and there is a lot of learning we all have to do. I mean, I feel like it's only the last 3-4 years that I've discovered the work of, say, Sitaram Goel and Ram Swaroop. There's so much more that I've just started to learn now. So we're all in this business of learning together, whether regardless of where we are in our careers. So to give you a quick and practical response, yes, please do connect with me on email, Twitter, Facebook, etc. I'd love to stay in touch. Because there is literally just a handful of social scientists you know, who are, you know, trying to talk about these issues. And we do have a big challenge because on the one hand, we have the academic establishment, which is, you know, ignoring us, or, you know, it's become even more entrenched in its extremities, and you're probably seeing a lot more of it. And on the other hand, we have a community which is been stuck on Twitter. So, I mean, I wanted to share one small example, both your question and the question from the gentleman who came earlier. You know, what has happened is, one of the reasons why this any kind of criticism or counter Hinduphobia work is getting so easily discredited is because the political baggage comes on very quickly, and many of us, you know, don't realize that, you know, we are ending up having to fight a fight for one political party or a particular personality instead of a fight for truth, a fight for, you know, 1 billion people, our ancestors, our lands, what's left of them. And I'm not saying, you know, it's up to each of us, you know, how much we want to invest emotionally, politically in a political party. That's up to us. But right now, there's this maya that everybody in the community seems to be in, that because there's a BJP government or there's a Hindu-friendly government, somehow everything is working out, or we just have to push them and they'll do. No, I'll give you a small example. You know, 2 years ago, when I believe it was when, you know, the desecration of Vyasaraya's Vrindavan took place in Nava Vrindavan in Hampi. It was a terrifying event. I wrote a small open letter to Prime Minister Modi and said, you know, he should speak out against anti-Hindu violence. And I mean, obviously, I know he's not going to see it or do anything, but I just wanted this statement made that this is a reality. Now, unfortunately, what has happened is some of the very same Hindu advocacy groups that you have in the US, they never go and speak out when there's violence against Hindus in India, right? I always wanted, like last week, there was a huge traffic jam in San Francisco because, you know, the farmers from California came, they clogged the Bay Bridge, they went around, surrounded the Indian consulate, and they did their protests. It made the news. And, you know, next thing you know, all the news channels in San Francisco are saying, oh my God, what's happening to farmers in India? Why are farmers protesting in California? So when people show up, it's noticed. So I've asked these Hindu groups very often, when a sadhu is killed in India, why doesn't any Hindu advocacy group stand out to the Indian consulate and just hold a sign saying we are concerned about the lives of Hindu sadhus in India? They don't do it because, you know, they have this idea. I think one is the broader social status idea, we don't do protests. And more specifically, let's be honest, many of these Hindu groups don't do it because they won't do it when a government they like is in power in India. So this has to be about something bigger than, you know, political calculations. So I think, you know, a Hindu advocacy group in America would gain more credibility if, you know, it actually stood up for Hindus even in India, regardless of which party is in power. So anyway, just wanted to, you know, get that off my shoulders. But yeah, thank you. I'm glad you're in political science, and I look forward to being in touch.
I mean, there's a lot that can be done, but I would like to ask Professor Juluri, what is it in Hindu society that actually, doesn't, make ordinary people take action at their individual level? Like, for instance, there are papers that are Hindu-phobic. You could easily not buy that paper. But even in devout Hindu homes, that is a sort of morning ritual in addition to all other rituals. I mean, why is it that these simple things, voting with your wallet, doesn't occur in Hindu society? I mean, all these movies and medias that we, are talking about are actually getting a lot of revenue from Hindus, ordinary Hindus.
So, no, that's, I think, some of the answers to that might be, religious in nature. There are people who are starting to speculate about this. I know there's people who believe that because we are not a quote unquote congregational faith, we somehow don't have this sense of how to act. I think we can also look at it sociologically. And I think what has happened is there is, some sort of an intergenerational collapse that has taken place where, the way there's a reason I think Hindus became sort of passive and just and all that, because in a way it helped us survive, and this is Ashish Nandi's famous thesis that, that the psychological survival strategy for Hindus in India uh, was to refrain from definition, to sort of be ambiguous, kind of say, yeah, yeah, whatever, to whoever came along. I'm simplifying it. So it worked maybe, at the peak of colonialism, and all these pressures were there on our religion, to convert, and, either convert or die. Somehow people, sorted it out. But then I think after independence, from one generation to the other, this just attitude basically descended, into just absolute passivity, and a kind of cowardice even. And I mean, the excuses are there, like you have people say, oh, we were all, just middle class, we can't afford to protest, we have to get jobs. So I mean, all that was there till now. Post 90s, you have many Hindus who are earning more than their parents, who are certainly economically better off than they were in, say, Nehru socialist India, and so on. But again, now the argument is, we're not really going to take any action because it's not for us. We are going to change things through our achievements and education and vague things like that. And I think, to answer your question specifically about even not doing small things, I think that's a very intriguing sociological dilemma that we have. But we just have to keep making it okay for people to resist this problem, to name it and shame it. Because, again, Conrad Elst just talked about it. In the 1990s, when the indigenous uprising, was like really peaking in the US and everywhere, the Ayodhya issue really was along the same lines. But we have completely lacked the ability to perceive it as an indigenous uprising. And we've thrown all our eggs into this, right-wing, nationalist paradigm or whatever. And that has really, really become baggage we can't handle today. So I've sort of thrown 3-4 ideas about, because obviously I don't have a simple, lucid answer about why we continue to, feed these monsters. But I think the important thing is to keep talking about it, one, and talk about it outside this right-wing or political party paradigm. And then hopefully more people, will understand, that it's very, very trendy. Fighting Hindu phobia is as trendy as fighting racism in America today. I think that's what people need to recognize.
We know that some of these, okay, most of us, right, by the time we complete our education and get into jobs and realize that there is such Hindu phobia and all this, we are almost nearing 30. So it's a shock to most of us. And then we do see that these attacks on Hindus, I mean, not literally, but so these do come from Islamist, Christian organization, Marxist organizations. So when we start posting on social media, so there's a lot of dilemma that is this going to hurt someone, because some of them are our colleagues or our friends with whom we work. So there's a little dilemma on this. So, I mean, I think you did answer it partly when in your talk, that you just concentrate on the topic and not on any organization or something like that, right? Is this something that can you elaborate on this?
How to actually broach very difficult issues when we are living and working in a very diverse world, right? I mean, and that's a very practical question, and I'm glad you asked that, because, I mean, let's face it, we are working in offices and studying in classrooms where, our colleagues and friends are from different communities and so on. And, it's very awkward because they have never heard criticism of what they might see as criticism of their faith, right? Or the moment they hear it, they're conditioned to think, oh, you must be, a Hindu nationalist, far right, Modi supporter or whatever, So they're completely primed that way. So we are already in an uphill task. But let me share a couple of examples. When I was in grad school in the 1990s, I studied in the Midwest. Later, I went to UMass, which is a little more, Marxist, left-leaning, etc. But in both places, I could see people were pushing these topics, whether it was the feminists or the gay rights activism, and that had just really picked up only in the 1990s. The whole LGBT movement and so on, and of course African Americans. So whenever they brought up these issues, there would be awkwardness. People would be awkward about it, and things like that. But then eventually people get used to it. And sometimes, of course, it can be excessive. People, today now it's become a circus, frankly. This kind of criticism. But if you think it's important, then you should, figure out a way to do it. And maybe my book will give you some ideas, just in terms of things like language, because we don't own language anymore. We're just borrowing words. That's why we use words like advocacy or right wing or nationalist, and, much more accurate words like indigenous, or a word like, liberal. I mean, we are more liberal than, frankly, even the liberals of America. Most so-called liberals in the West are just right-wingers. You can see that. So all these challenges are there. So maybe one, understanding there will be discomfort when these issues are being pushed, and it is challenging now because also post 2014, right? This this idea that there's a Hindu government in power is going to make everyone say like, oh, but Hindus are a majority, or 80% plus. There's a Hindu nationalist government in power. What are you guys complaining about? So those challenges are there, but we have to slowly get people used to the idea that these can be talked about. People talk about racism to white people, so we can eventually talk about these. The history of Christianity and Islam, whatever, slowly and very, very carefully. That's important.
Briefly describe about what are the positive things as an individual can take, when we see lot of issues with the Hindu-phobic content which can be seen on OTT and other movies. So as an individual, what should be our roles and how we can counter those things?
I think the most important thing you can do is just be more critical media consumers. It's not just the anti-racism, anti-sexism stuff. There is a lot of social investment in America on media and parenting. I gave a link to this organization called commonsensemedia.org, and that is something we've not quite done in India. And when you talk about media, be open-minded in the sense that criticize the Hindu-phobic content objectively, calmly, but also, criticize other things. There's a million other bad things the media are doing. They're spreading misogyny, and like the Gems of Bollywood Twitter handle, they're picking up so much, not just Hindu-phobia, but they're picking up, horrible and, misogynistic content from Bollywood, very, very bad stuff about women. So, call out those issues also, so that people recognize that what you're fighting is not just, misrepresentation of your people, but you're fighting the misrepresentation of truth and decency itself, right? And that is really where I think, as Hindus following this very universalist outlook like Sanatana Dharma, we really can do a good job, because I think in a sense it comes naturally for us. Being tribal is very difficult for us. That's why we are struggling, frankly. Organizing our collective strength, trying to find unity, then we lack. All of this doesn't work. But what seems to come naturally for us is just talking about anything that's, universally good for everybody. So I think as a human being, maybe the best thing you could do as an individual is cultivate a sense of discernment in media. Always remember that media isn't existing just to please us. It's there because people have put in money to either, make us buy stuff, or, manipulate our behavior, turn us into, slaves and consumers. So I think the way you could talk about it is just by talking about many, many things that are adharmic, in a sense, in the content of media too. But judge the context. Don't use a word like adharmic if you're in a secular environment. Use more modern terms for adharma, like misogynistic or racist or consumerist. So I know it's very broad advice, but I think if you have a good intent and clarity on how you use your words, even your individual effort will certainly, count for something. Well, how do I keep sane? Looking at so much Hindu phobia in academia and in the media, I also try to learn. So a few years ago, I started learning about the history of, I guess, really the history of nature. That was a topic that interested me. And I started a trilogy called the Kishkindha Chronicles, which is a fictional retelling of the adventures of Hanuman set in prehistoric India. Part one, Saraswati's intelligence sets up the story. This came out a couple of years ago. And earlier this year, I finally managed to publish part two. It's called The Firekeepers of Jwalapuram. Jwalapuram is a real place in Kurnool, Andhra Pradesh, where very important research discovery was made by the archaeologist, Professor Ravi Korisettar, about the existence of survivors from the Toba volcano explosion in 70,000 BC. But of course, my story is more about Hanuman and Sugriva and Vali and their family politics and this huge invasion of a violent race. So it's sort of a prehistoric Planet of the Apes, but with Hanuman story, very respectful. It is our gods I'm taking some creative liberties with, so I don't disrespect them at all. But yeah, if you like reading fiction, I would request you to check out both these novels of mine and let me know what you think so that I can also finish writing part 3 very soon.